Hey everyone, Laszlo Montgomery here. Welcome to the start of another CHP series that will trace the development of Chinese philosophy through the lives of about 36 philosophers. Some we'll look at in greater depth than others, and we'll trace the historical timeline and see where philosophy in China began, how it developed, and throughout this series we'll also examine the historic events going on in the background that were driving a lot of this thought. Let me encourage you to download the infographic that accompanies this series and to keep it handy. And just in case you're not a fluent Mandarin speaker, please refer to the master list of terms at the Teacup.media website. Just click on the convenient link at the show notes and that will get you access to the list of terms. You could download them and print them. It's my hope that, as Will Durant said in his introduction to classical Chinese philosophy, that this, quote, brief and superficial introduction leads you to study the Chinese philosophers themselves, as Goethe studied them, and Voltaire and Tolstoy, end quote. We look at these ancients and perhaps think, their world was so simple back then. They were so ignorant of so much knowledge and intellectual discovery that we take for granted in our day. Their circumstances compared to ours in the 21st century? What could we possibly have in common with these people from so long ago? Well, in examining the things they cared about and thought about, it turns out we have quite a bit in common with them. The historic scope of this series will span the beginnings of the Western Zhou dynasty to Wang Yang midway through the Ming dynasty, roughly 11th century BC to the 16th century. Half a millennia ago. The backdrop for the first part of this story was the Zhou dynasty. We always hear about how old China is, and this is pretty much the farthest back you could go in recorded Chinese history. Other than all the bronzeware, ironware, and other relics made from inorganic materials, not much from that time survived down to our day. The Chinese invented paper, but Cailun wouldn't launch the paper industry till the first century of the Common Era, during the Han. And all these eponymous works from these Zhou-era thinkers, the Laozi, the Mengzi, Xunzi, Zhuangzi, Liezi, Mozi, Hanfeizi, how much of that material can accurately be attributed to each philosopher, if any of it? The earliest works that have survived so far were all dug out of Han Dynasty tombs long after these philosophers were dead. All these texts that scholars said contain the words of Confucius and other masters ran the gauntlet of 25 centuries of argument and reinterpretation. Did we in the 21st century even receive 1% of what these classical philosophers actually said? And for those who can't read classical Chinese and have to read these ancient texts in a foreign language, I wonder how much of the beauty, subtleties, and perhaps true meaning behind a lot of the texts got papered over in translation. Feng Youlan, author of the groundbreaking A Short History of Chinese Philosophy, mentioned something interesting. He said, quote, religion was to other civilizations what philosophy was to China, end quote. He described religion as simply philosophy that also contains superstitions, dogmas, rituals, and institutions. Humanism, 人本主义, is what Confucius and other Chinese philosophers mainly concern themselves with. Matters of a metaphysical nature? Not as much. Not at the beginning, anyway. What mattered most in Chinese philosophy was worldly affairs and the role of humans in the big picture. Though there was plenty that was spiritual and mystical about Chinese philosophy, especially where Taoism was concerned. Practical matters such as ethics, morals, innate human knowledge, and politics figured most highly amongst all the great thinkers. When the Analects of Confucius and other Zhou-era classical works made their way to Europe, they were most warmly received. What an eye-opener that was for the intellectuals of the day. That these works even found their way to Europe was thanks to the Jesuit fathers in China, most prominently Ruggieri, Ricci, Charles von Bell, and Verbiest. When they began to crack that nut and learn the language and study the ancient texts, for the first time, Western readers got to hear these names like Confucian and Mengzi. And these Jesuits Latinized the names into Confucius and Mencius to allow Europeans to better know them. So thanks to these Jesuits and all their heavy lifting, learning the language and translating the ancient texts that were available to them, all the great minds of the Enlightenment got to be the first generation of people in the West to read how these Chinese philosophers preached loving thy neighbor as thyself and doing unto others as you would like them to do unto you, centuries before these words could be read in Matthew 7:12. Diderot had written of the Chinese, quote, "These peoples are superior to all other Asiatics in antiquity, art, intellect, wisdom, policy, and in their taste for philosophy." End quote. Voltaire wrote, quote, "The body of this empire has existed 4,000 years without having undergone any sensible alteration in its laws, customs, language, or even in its fashions of apparel. The organization of this empire is in truth the best that the world has ever seen." End quote. Yeah, these Enlightenment greats really put China on a pedestal. Of course, they all lived during the glory years of the Qing dynasty. No one was saying that late in the 19th century. I'll bring to your attention all the most important works and just mention a little bit about them. Some, like the Lunyu, or Analects of Confucius, and the Mengzi, the Zhuangzi, the Tao Te Ching, of course, those are the most famous and are quoted most often, along with Sun Tzu's Art of War, which we won't be covering in this course, but there were many others as well. These texts are all filled with poems, dialogues, chronologies, pronouncements, aphorisms, parables, diagrams, you name it. Some, like the Zhuangzi, the so-called second book of the Tao, stand on their own merits as works of literature, even in translation. The common thread that seems to run through every philosopher, from Yuzi to Wang Yangming, seems to always boil down to the question of how should someone live their life so that it's a worthwhile one. Are humans predisposed towards good or evil? And how should we, the sovereign down to the village nobody, treat each other? How should we organize ourselves and live together with the hopes that our conduct and way of thinking will cause there to be no need for punishments or war? Poured into the foundation of classical Chinese philosophy were the stories and deeds of the greatest of China's ancient sage kings. And from earliest times, the figures who were lionized more than any other, and who Confucius himself held up as the living ideals for what it meant to be a sage ruler, were three mythical emperors, Yao, Shun, and Yu. And three figures who we know in fact lived, Kings Wen and his two sons, King Wu and Zhou Gong, the Duke of Zhou. In all the thousands of years, there were so many great emperors and leaders, but those six who I just mentioned, they didn't live to see it, but all of them, singly and collectively, became a metaphor in Chinese culture and history for what it meant to contain all the virtues in spades and to be considered a sage ruler. As far as Yao, Shun, and Yu were concerned, well, despite their mythical status in our day, the Zhou dynasty historians said they were in fact real, and wrote with great certainty about who they were and when they lived. But the great historian whose words we most remember, Sima Qian, he was as far away from the time of Yao as he was from our day. Confucius had said of Yao, quote, "Concerning the good Yao, it is said that he ruled China for 100 years, the years of his life being 110 and 6. He was kind and benevolent as heaven, wise and discerning as the gods. From afar his radiance was like a shining cloud, and approaching near him he was as brilliant as the sun. Rich was he without ostentation, and regal without luxuriousness. He wore a yellow cap and a dark tunic, and rode in a red chariot, drawn by white horses. The eaves of his thatch were not trimmed, and the rafters were unplaned, while the beams of his house had no ornamental ends. His principal food was soup, indifferently compounded, nor was he choice in selecting his grain. He drank his broth of lentils from a dish that was made of clay, using a wooden spoon. His person was not adorned with jewels, and his clothes were without embroidery, simple and without variety. He gave no attention to uncommon things and strange happenings, nor did he value those things that were rare and peculiar. He did not listen to songs of dalliance. His chariot of state was not emblazoned. In summer he wore his simple garb of cotton, and in winter he covered himself with skins of the deer. Yet he was the richest, the wisest, the longest lived, and the most beloved of all that ever ruled China." End quote. We can see from the earliest times, when recorded history was just in its infancy, already the lines were being drawn about what qualities were good and what was decent and what was not. Confucius held Yao up as a model. Why was that? It's because he was plain, practical, had his 2 feet planted on the ground, wasn't swayed by luxuries and comforts, was devoid of selfish desires. So you can see early on, already, what is good is being defined. This standard for what constitutes human decency was starting to be more clearly defined. Even back then, it was considered good taste and good form to live and act humbly, modestly, not ostentatiously. So then what was bad? If Yao, Shun, and Yu were held up by many philosophers as paragons of virtue, who were the examples to avoid? Well, Confucius and later generations would point at 2 kings, and these 2 were among the earliest villains in Chinese history. They were kings Jie of Xia and Zhou of Shang. These 2 were the poster boys of wicked kings in Chinese history. Jie's time on this earth is traditionally pegged at 1728 to 1625 BCE, the time of Hammurabi in Babylon and the Jewish exodus from Egypt and the later Hyksos invasion of that land. The other one, Zhou, or Zhou Xin, he was the last ruler of the Shang dynasty. Both of these kings were remembered for their decadence that was only surpassed by their depravity, cruelty, and inattention to the demands of their job and the needs of their people. They were both in the same league as Roman emperors like Caligula or Commodus. Yeah, these 2 kings, King Jie and Zhou, they were the gifts that kept on giving over the centuries, not only for Confucius to point to, but other philosophers and politicians as well. Jie and Zhou, they too got to become metaphors, but not in their own lifetimes. So the spectrum of excellence to ignominy ran from Yao to Zhou, and then there was everything else in between. Later, the great thinkers of the Han Dynasty will come up with the notion of Tianming, or the mandate of heaven, when the ruler was more of a Yao than a Zhou. Heaven determined them fit to rule, and this mandate was manifested in all kinds of positive ways, usually with peace and prosperity throughout the land, as well as a dearth of natural disasters. And if the ruler turned out to be more of a Jie or a Zhou, heaven cut them loose by demonstrating its displeasure through any number of pandemics, disasters, or astronomical phenomena. All these stories, who knows what's true or not? This is what tradition tells us. The Xia, the Shang, this was all prelude to the Zhou dynasty. That's where the Big Bang happens for Chinese philosophy. And for 3 centuries or so, in this longest of all China's dynasties, comes the first part of our story. In 1949, a big year in Chinese history that was, German philosopher Karl Jaspers, 1883 to 1969, came up with this theory about an Ochsenzeit, or Axial Age, that took place in civilization stretching from the Mediterranean to the East China Sea, from about the 8th to the 3rd centuries BCE. Jaspers had pointed out that living in different places, completely unawares of one another, all at the same time period, were not just Confucius, Lao Tzu, Mo Tzu, Zhuangzi, and Liezi, but also Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and in India, Hinduism and Jainism were thriving. Gautama Buddha was also walking around India. Zoroaster was teaching in Persia. In fact, the year of Zoroaster's death was the year Confucius was born. In the Holy Land, these were the times of the prophets Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah. It was a very tight bandwidth when all these philosophers and thinkers lived. That was the marquee fact of Jaspers' theory of the Axial Age. These philosophers and founders of religions, arguably the first great thinkers produced by their respective ancient civilizations, all had their moment on this earth pretty much at about the same time. The lives of Confucius and the Buddha, only 12 years apart in age. Karl Jaspers said it in this way, quote, "The spiritual foundations of humanity were laid simultaneously and independently in China, India, Persia, Judea, and Greece. And these are the foundations upon which humanity still subsists today." End quote. Now, whether or not Jaspers' theory is true, we can't know for sure. It does have its critics. But surviving texts clearly show the most relevant issues that face human beings wherever they congregate in large numbers were being pondered and argued by all of these thinkers in all of these places at about the same time, for the first time. Okay, before we go any further, let's draw the curtains and call it a night here. Next time we convene, we'll look at pre-Confucian philosophy in China. Confucius passed in 479 BC. This was during the Eastern Zhou spring and autumn period. Many historians draw a line in the Eastern Zhou and use the death of the great sage as the demarcation point between the end of the spring and autumn and the start of the Warring States periods. The Warring States period of the Eastern Zhou dynasty lasted until 221 BC. The year King Yingzheng of the Qin Kingdom founded the Qin dynasty, China's first imperial dynasty where an emperor, not a king, ruled over a unified land. And that's all for next time. Much more to come, 17 more episodes, in fact. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from fantastic LA in the state of California, welcoming you to come back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.